Over this side now, do we have some hands for questions?
Just here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I can't see you, but I hear
hi.
you.
Bismillah here, and I'm representing the Association of Australian Tertiary Students from Afghanistan.
Okay.
I liked your speech, and thank you for the wonderful speech today. You mentioned that women's participation in negotiating tables are crucial in shaping peace and stability, especially in Afghanistan. But considering the politics of the country and the fragmentation of different ethnicities into sort of tribes and ethnicities in the country, and the dirty politics or game that is going on there, what would be your suggestion? Because most women in Afghanistan are illiterate, uneducated, and even when they are on the table and they are in the parliament, they would still be swayed by those political games and the dirty tricks that they have. The clear example was the other year when they passed the legislation which was totally against the rights of women, even in the rights of movement and speaking without the permission of the men. But a lot of the women, 22% in parliament, but there's still a lot of a great majority of them voted for the legislation. So what would be your suggestion and programs that UN could do to address such problems in countries like Afghanistan?
It's a great question. And I think it's a really big challenge, but especially when you're talking about political and tribal representation, because a lot of times, and I'll give you the example of the recent government formation in Iraq. When the government spent 8 months after elections to form, so it literally entered the Guinness Book of World Records as the longest government formation, they emerged with no women. So they had no women in the ministries. And I honestly don't think it was intentional. I think that they wanted to make sure that all the political parties were represented, and so they divided out the seats, and they're not going to put a woman as the representative of a political party. It's always going to be a male. It's always going to be the top. And that was one of the issues that emerged, is that, again, in the politics of appeasement, women are falling through the cracks. But more specifically for your question in terms of women who are part of the process, or who are part of the parliament, similar to Afghanistan, Iraq has a quota of 25% of women who have to be part of the parliament. Most of these women are, in many cases, the worst nightmare for women. So they will be pulling their political party line even harder than the men. And the reason is, first of all, just political strategy. They want to get appointed. They want to rise within the ranks of their political party. And then when it comes to some of the more conservative parties, they adopt that conservative standpoint and often will vote on laws that are pro-women in the negative. And so, it is a little bit of a challenge. And I think one of the things that needs to be done better is, educating grassroots and stuff in terms of pushing for the right representatives, but really targeting the training of the representatives and making them aware that you don't necessarily have to be a champion of women's issues. Again, it's a lot of pressure to expect from the 22 or the 25%, but here's why it's important for you to be pushing your political party. And often, and I remember in Iraq there was a transition government, and there was something called the Interim Government Council, and there were all men except 3 women. One of the women was assassinated within the first few months, so that left 2 women. And one woman was a businesswoman, the other woman was a gynecologist. And I remember the gynecologist telling me, because we were very frustrated because she kept voting against women's issues. And we said, what are you doing? You're our only person who we think should be pushing women's rights. What are you doing? And she said, you've put me in the room with all these tribal leaders, these, born politicians. Give me a pregnant woman and I'll give you a healthy child. But I'm not a politician. I don't know what to do. And so we often put people who just simply don't have the skill set. Just as a side note, most of the men in parliament don't have skill sets either, so it's not a matter of equal. But if we could really target and train these women not on women's rights, but on negotiation skills, on facilitation skills, on some of the hard skills that will make them kind of on balance, and it's going to take a lot of time, but on balance with some of the men in parliament, they'll gain a lot more confidence and begin to be able to do a lot more challenging. And I've seen it done. I mean, one of the most difficult conservative parties to work with in Iraq are the Sadrs, are the people who follow Muqtada Sadr, are very conservative, and the women often are always challenging me and, think that I'm, a Western spy and all kinds of things. But over time, with a lot of the training and a lot of the hard skills, where I just stopped talking to them about women's issues, we gain trust and we gain and now I have some who are very powerful allies and who will work with me on issues of education, will work with me on small business enterprises, and that's my entry point to then start challenging on some of the more issues that pertain to women. But it's a long process, and I think that's what's frustrating, again, going back to that window of opportunity. So it's important that the international community is finding the right allies inside and waiting for the cues and providing the pressure and support after the cues from the local. We shouldn't be doing or leading things on our own. We need to be taking the cues from the local groups. But, kind of that parallel approach is the best way to, in my very humble opinion. I'm sure other people have better strategies, but, I found that to be a very good way to move forward.
Now, Anu has a question. I'm going to ask Colin to give the microphone. Thank you.
It was actually another suggestion that seems to have worked quite well in the international scene, is to have cross-party women's platforms. So to have women from both the party in power and from the opposition, to create those kinds of platforms where there is a space to discuss women's issues, and caucusing and bringing those women together to look at common issues is one way of getting over having to pull the party line. Mm-hmm. And Timor-Leste has tried that, and it's been quite, well, I wouldn't say quite successful, but at least the attempt has been made to bring women from different political parties together on a common women's platform to try and raise some of those issues. So that's another idea as to something that could be tried. That's
a great, it reminds me of an important discussion, because in Iraq, the Women's Caucus, that approach was tried, and it highlights one of the challenges that happened inside Iraq that I think is important to discuss, was that the women, again, going back to the first point, in 2003, the women were the first to unite. But because of the political and a lot of the issues of the educated and the different structures, what ended up happening today, which is a little bit of the theme, is we've actually gone backwards 2011 compared to 2003, is women in Iraq polarized. And basically where they polarized wasn't so much political as it was secular versus religious conservatism. And so the caucus kept failing. I mean, there's a formal caucus that's supposed to be part of the Iraqi parliament, but they never meet, and when they do meet, they fight quite a lot because they've polarized between religious and between secular. And I think, often the elite and the grassroots, this polarization, I think, is the biggest threat to women globally, is how can we make sure that we don't fall into that line of polarization, but maybe through, positive experiences of caucuses and maybe even building in civil society and provincial councils, push past that so that they don't continue to go to different sides. And it's something that currently in Iraq we're working on programs to talk about introducing women's rights, CEDAW, Resolution 1325, but through an Islamic framework and through an Islamic lens so that people will be able to accept. And it kind of strips away the arguments that this is just Western and anti-Islamic.
I know what it is to fight, you don't.
Yeah.
And some of the young women's voices, I think, really need to be supported to come up and have that platform as well. Their views might differ, but they certainly have an opinion.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Very true. And it's funny, in my book I talk a lot about identity, because in addition to working on women's issues, there was a lot of issues with my own identity. And I found it fascinating that the one thing that trumped gender in terms of working in the region, which was difficult, was age. People really were not willing to, open discussions with me because I was a 20-something woman, and they were just like, no, you got to be in your 50s for us to take you seriously. And so that was, again, a part of the negotiations, was to kind of get them to respect me and my skill set. But, age was one of the hardest things.